Settle down, we can start the Home Office statement on the Dawn Sturgis inquiry, and I call the Minister Dan Jarvis.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement on the Dawn Sturgis inquiry, which has today published its report. I start, Madam Deputy Speaker, with Dawn Sturgis. The untimely and sudden death of a much-missed mother, partner, daughter, sister and friend is a deeply personal tragedy. And today we keep her and her loved ones in our thoughts and in our prayers. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 4th of March 2018, Sergei and Yulia Skripal were targeted by the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Services. 3 GRU agents flew to the UK intent on killing Sergei Skripal. 2 agents, known as Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Basharov, travelled to Salisbury and contaminated the door handle of Sergei's house with the nerve agent novichok, with callous and despicable disregard for others who might enter or leave that address. Sergei and Yulia were poisoned and spent weeks in a critical condition. Others, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, were harmed as they responded to the incident. Then, on the 30th of June 2018, Charlie Rowley gave his partner Dawn Sturgis a gift of a Nina Ricci perfume bottle. She sprayed her wrists with the contents. Tragically, the bottle contained novichok and had been recklessly thrown away by Petrov and Basharov as they left Salisbury 4 months earlier. Dawn died at Salisbury Hospital on the 8th of July 2018. An inquest was opened. However, it was clear that a proper examination of Dawn Sturgis's death would require a statutory public inquiry, which has been chaired by Lord Hughes. Today, after an extensive and painstaking process, the inquiry has published its report. The inquiry has found that those who were involved in the assassination attempt against Sergei Skripal were morally responsible for Dawn's death, and that deploying a highly toxic nerve agent in a busy city was an astonishingly reckless act. The Chair concludes that the operation must have been signed off at the highest level of the Russian state, including President Putin. Now, in respect to the emergency services treatment of Dawn, the inquiry found that she received entirely appropriate medical care, but that tragically her condition was unsurvivable. In terms of preventability, the Chair has concluded that the government's public health advice following the attack on the Skripals was reasonable. He also found that although there were failings in the management of Sergei Skripal, the risk of assassination by Russian personnel was reasonably assessed, and based on that assessment, he did not need a new identity. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the inquiry has been clear in its findings of responsibility, and we must respond equally unequivocally. Now, I've described the acute threat that Russia poses to the UK and to our national security to honourable members in the House previously. Its recent acts have ranged from murdering Alexander Litvinenko, using a deadly nerve agent in Salisbury, espionage, arson, cyber attacks, and the targeting of UK parliamentarians for interference operations. Since 2018, the UK has been at the forefront of the response against Russia. In direct response to the poisonings, the then government expelled 23 Russian undeclared intelligence officers. This triggered the expulsion of over 150 Russian diplomats by 28 countries, including NATO allies. The UK has subsequently committed to prevent the rebuild of Russian intelligence and to remove Russian dirty money in the UK, developed legislative powers to harden the UK's defences against state threats, and delivered new port and border powers, increased security checks on goods from Russia, and banned Russian-owned or linked aircraft from entering the UK. The invasion of Ukraine introduced a stark new reality and demonstrated Russia's intent to undermine European security as well as global security. The UK has led the way, standing by Ukraine and providing unprecedented military, humanitarian and diplomatic support. In total, the UK has committed £21.8 billion for Ukraine and has sanctioned over 2,900 individuals, entities and ships. This government is proud to be at the forefront of the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine in defending its sovereignty and security. Now, this has inevitably made the UK a target for increased hostile activity by Russia. Following an arson attack in East London in May of 2024, the then Home Secretary warned of a pattern of Russian malign activities across Europe which had reached UK soil. In response, the UK expelled the Russian defence attaché and removed diplomatic status from Russian properties believed to have been used for intelligence purposes. We are determined that the UK remains a hard operating environment for the Russian intelligence services. In October last year, we sanctioned 3 Russian agencies and 3 senior figures who were attempting to undermine and destabilise Ukraine and its democracy. And in July, the UK sanctioned and exposed 3 GRU units and 18 of their military intelligence officers for the targeting of Yulia Skripal and cyber operations in support of Putin's illegal war in the Ukraine. Yet we are now grappling with an increasingly reckless methodology. The Director General of MI5 recently highlighted Russian state actors turning to proxies for their dirty work, recruiting disposable individuals on social media platforms, instructing them via encrypted apps, and then offering payment in cryptocurrencies. UK law enforcement has secured convictions in several significant cases just this year. 6 individuals spying for Russia, 6 men involved in an arson attack on a warehouse supplying Ukraine, an individual who attempted to offer services to Russian intelligence, and a former MEP who accepted bribes to promote pro-Russian narratives in the EU Parliament. These cases serve as a strong reminder for anyone seeking to facilitate or undertake hostile state activity for Russia on UK soil. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government remains committed to providing our law enforcement partners with the tools that they need to tackle these threats. We've specified Russia on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme to make it even more challenging to conceal relationships with the Russian state. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I can now announce that the government is going further. Today, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has imposed a further cost on the Russian regime by sanctioning the GRU under the Russia sanctions regime, along with several associated individuals. These sanctions recognise the continued reckless and destabilising activity of the GRU, which seeks to undermine Ukraine, European security and the safety of the United Kingdom. They will include sanctions against 8 GRU officers under the cyber sanctions regime and 3 GRU officers under the Russia sanctions regime who have been implicated in hostile activity across Europe. We are also summoning the Russian ambassador to hold Russia to account for its responsibility for the tragic death of a British citizen. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's also been extensive misinformation and disinformation relating to these horrific and barbaric poisonings. This inquiry has categorically rejected those falsehoods, and this government continues to reject the lies spread by Russia through its propaganda and through its paid mouthpieces. I wish to wholeheartedly, I'm sure on behalf of the whole House, thank Lord Hughes and his team. This was a considerable task of great importance, and they have collectively approached it with diligence, care and sensitivity. I also want to take, I'm sure on behalf of the whole House, the opportunity to thank the first responders, military personnel, the scientists, the medical practitioners and all of those responsible for responding to the attack. They are the very best of us, and I know that members right across the House will join me today in paying tribute to them for the important work that they do to keep us safe. Madam Deputy Speaker, Dawn Sturgis was the victim of an utterly reckless and dangerous act, a chemical weapons attack perpetrated by Russia on British soil. The pain and suffering it has caused can never be underdone. But we must honour Dawn Sturgis's memory, uphold truth and justice, and keep everyone in our country safe. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, let me start by thanking the Security Minister for advance sight of his statement and setting out straight away that the opposition, of course, fully support the government's work in keeping our country safe. And I think I agree with and support everything the Security Minister said in his statement just a moment ago. I particularly welcome the additional sanctions that he announced in relation to certain members of the Russian security services. I also join with the Security Minister in remembering Dawn Sturgis, who lost her life as a result of this reckless and barbaric attack, leaving highly dangerous chemical weapons lying around was a reckless undertaking by those Russian agents, and Dawn Sturgis's death lies squarely at their door. I also pay tribute to Sergei and Yulia Skripal for the bravery they have shown when faced with targeting by agents of the Russian state, who came to this country specifically with the purpose in mind of killing them. I also pay tribute to the emergency services and security services, as the Security Minister did, who responded so bravely, and some of whom, like Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, themselves were harmed as they responded to this attack. The emergency services and security services on that day and in the days following, I think, distinguished themselves greatly, and I know the whole House will want to thank them for the work they did. Now, the chair of the inquiry concluded, as the Security Minister said, that this operation would have been signed off, would have been agreed to at the very highest level of the Russian state by President Putin himself. And that, I think, makes an important point, that Russia is a dangerous and a hostile state, and that Vladimir Putin is a dangerous and hostile leader, a man who this inquiry has found personally sanctioned the assassination of civilians on British soil. And of course, the atrocities that the Russian state and President Vladimir Putin perpetrate are not confined to those we've discussed today. We've seen on their own soil the Russian state murder domestic political opponents like Alexei Navalny. We've seen them shoot down civilian airliners. We have seen them interfere across Africa. And we have seen Putin support former President Assad of Syria in persecuting civilians in Syria, including supporting the use of chemical weapons. So we should be in no doubt at all about the threat that Russia and President Putin pose, not just on our soil, not just in Russia or in Ukraine, but across the whole world. And I think there is a lesson there for the way that we in the West collectively consider the Ukraine conflict, which the Security Minister spoke about. I think the actions we've been discussing this afternoon are one of many reasons why we in the West should be steadfast and unwavering in our support for Ukraine. The lessons of history are quite clear. Appeasement doesn't work. Showing weakness when faced with an aggressive dictator simply emboldens them. And I hope those people in our government and other governments, particularly the American administration, keep that in mind as they conduct negotiations in the coming days and weeks. Now, I know the Security Minister will not be able, quite rightly, to be able to comment on details, but I know the House will appreciate an update and assurances about the work being done to protect us domestically against Russian threats. He didn't mention in his speech cyber threats, and we know, of course, that Russia actively and repeatedly, he did mention it, I do apologise, he did mention it, Russia repeatedly and deliberately target both governmental infrastructure and private sector IT infrastructure. And an update on the work he is leading to counter that would be welcome so far as he is able to, and whether he can give any indication as to whether we are proactively engaged in degrading Russia's capability in that area. I appreciate there are severe limitations around what he can say, but any indication he can provide to the House, I think, would be very much appreciated. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the lessons which we can draw from this episode relate not just to Russia, but relate to any state where we have intelligence or information that they are engaged in aggressive, hostile acts. And we know, of course, that it's not just Russia. Other states, including China, are engaged in different but potentially equally damaging espionage and other activity on our soil. And the lesson that this episode, I think, teaches us is that we can't be complacent. We can't prioritise, for example, economic links above national security. We need to be on the front foot when it comes to these threats. And in that spirit, and drawing that lesson from this episode, perhaps the Security Minister can explain to the House why China is not in the enhanced tier of FIRS, which, in my opinion, it should be, and why the government appears to be contemplating granting planning consent for a super embassy for China on a very sensitive site close to sensitive communications infrastructure, and from which it is very likely China will conduct large-scale espionage activities. The lesson this episode teaches us is that we can't be complacent and we must be active and energetic in protecting our national interest. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, in general terms, I fully support the direction of travel the Security Minister has set out, and of course the opposition will support him personally and the government in the work they're doing to keep our country safe.
Minister Jarvis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Shadow Home Secretary for his response and the tone of it? I'm very grateful for it. I think he will have noted from my opening remarks that the gravity and the seriousness with which I attach to the matter at hand, and I know that he and Right Honourable and Honourable members opposite will have noted that in my opening statement I spoke seamlessly about the work done by the previous government and this one, because I believe that standing against Russia and the threat that they pose to our national security should be and is a shared endeavour across this House. And I pay tribute to the work that the previous government did at the time of 2018 and beyond that in standing against the threat that we face. And wherever possible, we should work closely together on it. I thought the Shadow Home Secretary very accurately characterised the nature of the threat. I agree with what he said with regard to Russia and with regard to Putin, and it is impossible to overstate the seriousness of this attack and other activity that he characterised. He spoke about Ukraine, and I'm grateful to him for doing so. And again, I do want to take the opportunity to pay tribute to the previous government for the commitment that they made to defending Ukraine. I think it should be a matter of great pride across this House that perhaps above almost everything else, it is something that binds this House together. There is a unity of purpose amongst us all in ensuring that we stand together to support Ukraine in their fight against Russia. And I give him and the House an absolute commitment that we will continue the work of the previous government. Genuinely, I was really pleased that he asked about cyber, because cyber is something that I am particularly keen to ensure that we coordinate our activity across government as effectively as we possibly can. In truth, it was one of the reasons why the Prime Minister made the machinery of government change back in September to ensure that the Security Minister now sits across both departments, the Home Office and the Cabinet Office, so that I can more effectively coordinate that work. He will know that the government introduced the Cyber Resilience Bill just a couple of weeks ago, and from a Home Office perspective, we are working hard on the ransomware proposals that we consulted on earlier in this year. He was right to make the important point about the work that we do with regard to positively degrading the nature of the threats that he described. He knows, and I'm very limited in terms of what I can say about that, but I know that he will join with me in paying tribute to the very important work that the National Cyber Force do. It didn't come as a huge surprise, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Shadow Home Secretary, and in truth I don't blame him for doing so, took the opportunity to raise the issue of China. I hope he's had the chance to look at what I said this morning at Cabinet Office oral questions and what I said in response to an urgent question from my honourable friend yesterday with regard to the government's position on China. I hope he's taken the opportunity to look precisely at what I said about the embassy. With regard to FIRS, I completely understand the points that he has made. The government continues to keep this under very close review, and I hope that we'll have more to say about it in due course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My thoughts are also with the family of Dawn Sturgis. In 2010, Putin said, and I quote, "Traitors would kick the bucket, believe me." Post-Litvinenko, how can it be our country can afford protection for, say, a former Prime Minister such as Liz Truss, but not for an asset such as Sergei Skripal? Yesterday's story in the newspaper underlines the issue about Russian agents infiltrating into our society, and the points that the Minister makes across the board are so well put. But given Putin has no concern, as we've heard, for life, least of all in his own country, can the Minister confirm that he is working with all departments across government to assure the British public of their safety and their security?
Madam Deputy Speaker, well, I'm grateful to him for his contribution and the work that he does chairing his committee. The quote he described is chilling, and in response to the point that he made yesterday about the coverage in the newspaper, I can give him the assurances that he seeks and tell him and the House that we take all national security threats incredibly seriously. This government has acted decisively by introducing tougher legislation, enforcing sanctions, and working closely with our international partners to make the UK one of the most challenging environments for our adversaries to operate in. That continues to be an absolute priority in terms of securing our national security, and I am absolutely determined to ensure that the United Kingdom is the hardest possible target for our adversaries.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Will Forster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to thank the Security Minister for speaking for the whole House when he gave our sincere condolences to Dawn Sturgis' family, when he paid tribute to the emergency and security services, but also when he gave his thoughts for those affected in the Novichok attack. Madam Deputy Speaker, a government's primary role is to keep our country safe. This report into the tragic killing of Dawn Sturgis on the streets of UK by Russian agents in their attempt to assassinate Sergei Skripal is damning. The report has found Vladimir Putin was responsible for a death of an innocent British citizen on our shores. Basic protections were not in place. Sergei was a clear target from Russian state assassins. The inquiry states that he was resettled in the UK under his own name. Russia used this to track him down, and MI5 failed to rename him. Can the Minister confirm to the House why the security services left him in an alarmingly accessible situation, despite clearly being an identified target of Russian state assassination, including residing in Salisbury in his own name? How has the security services justified to the Minister their apparent failure to implement even basic protective measures, such as CCTV, alarms or secure accommodation? Worryingly for UK security, Putin's assassins had no trouble locating him. That failure put him at risk, but exposed the wider public in Salisbury and across the country. That contributed to the death of Dawn, an entirely innocent member of the public. Last year, the Sturgis family's legal team described the Skripals as sitting ducks due to failings that should have been foreseen by MI5. Given the preventable deaths and public risk, what accountability measures will the government take to ensure MI5 protects both vulnerable individuals and the wider public? Considering the threat Russia poses to world security, especially security at home, will the government finally seize the £30 billion in Russian frozen assets across the UK, including Sutton Place in my constituency of Woking? And finally, the government needs to see this report as a turning point for the threat Russia poses to the UK. Will they launch an investigation into Russian interference in British politics to ensure no more UK politicians, like the former leader of the Reform Party in Wales, will be bribed with Russian money?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, let me say at the outset that he's absolutely right about the importance of keeping our country safe, and I give him an assurance that we take that incredibly seriously. Of course, we will look very carefully at the detail of this report. He asked me about the accountability mechanisms that exist in government, and I can give him an assurance that the Home Secretary and I take our responsibilities to hold the security services to account very, very seriously indeed. And that is a process that the new Home Secretary and myself dedicate a significant amount of time to every single week. But I do think that we have to be crystal clear that the inquiry's report states unequivocally that the responsibility lies with the Russian state. The chair of the report found that the operation to assassinate Sergei Skripal was authorised at the highest level and concluded that it would not have taken place without the approval of President Putin. The use of a military-grade nerve agent on British soil was a violation of international law and a truly despicable act. And the responsibility for that lies with Russia and Russia alone. Now, he entirely reasonably asked me about the seizing, the confiscation of sovereign Russian assets. I can give him assurance that we take that incredibly seriously as well. Our priority is to ensure that all of the options that we consider with regard to that particular matter are in line with international law and are economically and financially responsible. But Russia must be held accountable for the terrible damage that they've done in Ukraine, and we will do whatever we can to make sure that they are held accountable and that they are made to pay for their actions. His final point was an important one and was about the interference by Russia in our democracy. I chair the Defending Democracy Task Force, which has recently had its mandate renewed by the Prime Minister. These are matters that we take incredibly seriously. We use the task force as the fulcrum point across government to ensure that we have a whole-of-system response that draws together both government departments and law enforcement, and I give him an assurance of the priority that we attach to that work. But it is something that I believe should be a cross-party endeavour. So if the Honourable Member or if other members of this House wish to discuss it with me further, I'd always be very happy to do that.
Meyer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today, a British citizen died on British soil as a result of a Russian attack. Ought to have been a wake-up call for everyone in this country, and I recognise the steps the previous government took and this one is taking to address that threat. The reality is Russian planes and ships menace our airs and waters. Their cyber attacks have hit our NHS and councils, including Redcar and Cleveland's, and their propaganda has been disseminated by British politicians and online as well. And so will the Security Minister agree with me that where the British public are concerned, this is not a distant threat elsewhere in the world, it is here now affecting them today? And can I push him specifically on the point around social media disinformation and what steps he can take working with DCIT to address it in this country?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right about the threat. It isn't a distant matter. It is one that quite literally impacts on the lives of our citizens every single day. I give him an assurance of how seriously we take these matters, but he's also, I think, right to raise the issue of mis- and disinformation. Again, through the Defending Democracy Task Force, these are matters that we keep under very close review. He's right to mention the important contribution that is required of DCIT, work very closely with DCIT and with other government departments on these matters. We keep a constant vigilance. I think that there is more, in truth, that we need to do, and I'll be having further conversations with my ministerial colleagues about that particular matter.
Honourable Member of Parliament for Salisbury, John Glenn.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank the Security Minister for early sight of his statement, and can I thank him most warmly for the way that he has presented the government's response this afternoon. As someone who has spent previous life in Salisbury and South Wiltshire, I think he has served the people of my constituency very well, and I'm very pleased also with the remarks of the Shadow Home Secretary. This report today was written as a consequence of the need to bring clarity, to understand unequivocally who was responsible for what happened in 2018. But I think it's important to remember the huge impact it had on Salisbury, and obviously the tragedy that befell Dawn Sturgis, Charlie Rowley, Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, and Yulia and Sergei Skripal. This report is very clear about where responsibility and culpability lies. It lies with President Putin. Russia was responsible, and Putin as an individual was responsible. He personally ordered what happened in Salisbury, and we should never forget it. Putin is a ruthless dictator, not someone deals can be done with. And contrary to one of the candidates in the general election last year in Salisbury who said, I admire him as a political operator, I do not. I never will. I welcome what the Minister has said with respect to additional sanctions, and I would encourage him and his successors to always pursue energetically, with continued vigilance, further necessary measures as required. I welcome what he said about more sophisticated threats emerging on cyber, and I would urge him to extend that to look at what happens with our cloud infrastructure. I just have one question, if I may. Point 6.25 in the report refers to the issue of regular written assessments that were lacking in terms of the ongoing care, if you like, of Sergei Skripal. I think that is the only element that needs serious review for individuals like him in future. But can I finish by thanking the Minister again for the way he has spoken today, which will give huge comfort to my constituents in Salisbury and to the families of those so tragically affected.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I commend the Right Honourable Gentleman for the dignified and diligent way in which he represented his constituency at the time, and for his service since and again today. I know it will be hugely appreciated across the House, and certainly in the great city of Salisbury and across the wider great county of Wiltshire. And he's absolutely right in what he said today. Responsibility for this dreadful attack rests at the top of the Russian regime with President Putin. I give him the assurance that he seeks that this government, and I am sure, certainly hope, any successor governments or ministers will be incredibly vigilant, and we will pursue whatever measures are required. And I've noted the point he made about the cloud, which I think is a good one. In terms of the specific point he made with regard to the regular written assessments, I will take that one away and look closely at it. But again, can I commend him for his service to the great city of Salisbury?
Sean Woodcock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Minister for his statement, and I'm pleased to hear of further sanctions. In his statement, he stated that Dawn Sturgis was the victim of an utterly reckless and dangerous act. I would go further and call it a heinous crime, and which responsibility lies with Vladimir Putin, among many other such crimes that he is responsible for. But in his statement, he also talked about we must honour Dawn Sturgis' memory. And my question to the Minister, or my plea to the Minister rather, would be that we do that by never allowing Vladimir Putin to escape responsibility or accountability for the crime that was perpetrated in Salisbury on that day.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I completely agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and I think he put it very well. The greatest legacy, as well as, of course, remembering the tragic loss of life in this case, would be to ensure that our collective defences as a country are tightened to the extent that such an attack could never happen again. Of course, the Russian regime will be constantly testing our defences, and of course we will have to remain incredibly vigilant. And of course it is the responsibility of government to ensure that we've got the appropriate levels of resource, and that the United Kingdom is the hardest possible operating environment for Russia and its proxies. But he's right to remind us of where responsibility for this heinous act lies. It lies with President Putin.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also welcome the statement and indeed the additional sanctions that the Minister has announced today. It's absolutely right we do everything we can to resist Russia's attacks on our security and its attempts to suborn our democracy, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, and it's obviously absolutely right that the traitorous former MEP that the Minister mentioned is now in prison. I speak as the member representing Amesbury, the town that Dawn Sturgis was in when she took the fatal poison, represented at the time by my right honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Salisbury, and I also want to acknowledge his leadership throughout these difficult years for Salisbury and Amesbury. It does appear from the report that the NHS did a good job in its immediate response to the medical emergency that Dawn suffered, but it's also apparent that the wider system around that supported the community in Salisbury and Amesbury, the response was somewhat messy, for perhaps perfectly understandable reasons. Can the Minister assure us that the government generally is looking at our public safety response in the event of crises like this? And can he tell us what more can be done to ensure that in any future event, local communities are properly supported?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to him for the very sensible and constructive nature of the remarks that he's made today. And of course, I recognise his service as a Wiltshire MP and his obvious constituency interest in this matter. I also genuinely welcome the condemnation of the treachery that we have seen recently, and I'm grateful that he made that point as well. He raised, I think, a very sensible and constructive point with regard to the NHS, and I can give him the assurances that he seeks in terms of the government's attention to these matters. One of the reasons why the Prime Minister took the machinery of government change back in September to ensure that the Security Minister I sit across both the Home Office and the Cabinet Office was to maximise the leverage and coordination across government with regard not only to national security policy, but also with regard to our resilience. And we've recently undertaken, I think, the largest ever resilience exercise across government. So he's right to raise that point. I give him an assurance about the seriousness with which we take these matters. Of course, we will look very carefully at the recommendations in that regard within the report, but I'm grateful to him for the comments he's made today.
Charles.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The number of Russian spies operating in the UK is the highest it's been since the Cold War. Not my words, but the head of counter-terrorism policing. And I welcome the sanctions today on the GRU, but the Security Minister will know that the United Kingdom is probably regarded as Russia's #1 enemy, not the United States, but the United Kingdom. And he will know also there are other agencies operating internationally and have an international footprint, such as the FSB and SVR, whilst noting and recognising, should we say, diplomatic reciprocity and the importance of that. What more can be done, to quote him, have a hard operating environment for both of those agencies? And finally, are other Russian political dissidents safe here in the United Kingdom? And secondly, given the proliferation of chemical weapons, and we know that a chemical agent and a nuclear agent was used in some of the cases outlined today, and given the breakdown in many countries and the security around chemical weapons in those countries, whether Africa, whether in other parts of the world, how confident is he that the security services are aware of where those chemical weapons might be and where they might be tempted to be deployed?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman, as I always am, for the expertise and experience that he brings to these matters, not least given his very long-standing service on 2 relevant committees in this place. He mentioned CT Police, and let me use that as an opportunity to pay tribute to the work that they do. I have a very good and close working relationship with CT Police. I think that they do extraordinary work. It is a privilege to stand alongside them, and they are exceptional in the work that they do. It is in part a symptom of the work that the previous government and this government did to make the UK the hardest possible operating target, that increasingly Russia and other malign states are seeking the use of criminal proxies to do their bidding and their business in the United Kingdom. And there is a lot of work taking place, not only across government, but working very closely with our allies in Europe and further afield to ensure that we are best placed to target malign states using criminal proxies. And the Director General of MI5 referenced that in his recent annual threat lecture. So I give him an assurance that in terms of the point about the UK being a hard target, and he will understand better than most, I'm very limited in terms of what I can say about that, and it would be unwise to give detail that would be helpful to our adversaries. But I give him, again, an assurance of the seriousness with which we take these matters. He raised an important point about dissidents, and again, that's something that I keep under very, very close review, and we make sure that we've got the right and most appropriate mechanisms in place to provide security. His point about chemical weapons was well made. We work very closely with our international allies to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to minimise the risk and the threat. That is not easy work, and there are no guarantees of its success, but I do give an assurance of the seriousness with which we take it, and the approach that we want to undertake is to work closely with our allies.
Dave Dugan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I join the Security Minister in acknowledging the memory of Don Sturgis and the sacrifice of Don's partner Charlie and Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey and the fearless first responders. In the 7 years since this attack, we've seen an emboldened Putin increase his aggression across Europe. So can the Minister assure the House today that all lessons around this inquiry will be acted on in full? And will the UK Government continue to work with our EU partners in standing up to Putin's aggression in Europe and underscore that it is our multilateral pursuit of and defence of the international rules-based order that is our strength, and it is his isolationist aggression that will forever be his weakness?
I'm grateful for him, for the comments that he's made, and I can give him the assurances that he seeks. As I know that he will acknowledge, the report was published less than a couple of hours ago, but the government will look very carefully at the findings of it. And I give him and the House an assurance that where there is a requirement to act, we won't hesitate to do so. I think his point about EU partners was well made. We value our relationships with our neighbours, with our EU partners, with our Five Eyes colleagues. I recently met with the G7 to discuss these matters as well. We are much stronger in terms of standing against the nature of the threats that we face when we join up with our international partners, and that absolutely is the right approach. In terms of what he said about a rules-based order, I completely agree with that, and I'm sure all members of this House will. That is the right approach. Respecting international law, standing with our allies, that is the best way in which we can defeat Putin.
Julian Lewis.
Has the government formed a view as to why President Putin, the killer in the Kremlin, chose to target Sergei Skripal after he had been pardoned and exchanged? Nothing that I'm saying now derives from my time chairing the Intelligence and Security Committee, but I recall speculation in the press that it was because Mr. Skripal had been actively involved with either the British state or the military, or in some way being, should we say, active in opposing the government of the country from which he had been exchanged. If that is the case, then surely the conclusion in paragraph 818 that the only measures which could have avoided the attack would have been such as to hide him completely with an entirely new identity should indeed have been considered, and it's rather surprising that they weren't. So was Skripal engaged in anything that made him a target?
Minister Jarvis.
Well, the right honourable gentleman knows the very high regard in which I hold him, but he will also understand that he's asked me some important questions, but not necessarily questions that it would be in the interest of our national security for me to get into in any great detail. I can say to him that I have formed a view about the motive that underpins this particular attack, but I'm not going to get into it today. I think and I give him an assurance that we'll look carefully at the point he made about the detail of the report. We will look at that. It was a point raised by the honourable gentleman opposite as well, and we will go very carefully through the detail of all of this report, and I will consider what he said today as well. But I think the conclusion that I draw, which is the conclusion that Lord Hughes has drawn, is that responsibility for this attack lies with the Russian estate. And it is the government's responsibility to ensure, mindful of the nature of the threat that we pose, that we do everything to guard against that threat.
Sarah Ball.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To the extent that he is able, can the Minister please explain what steps he's taken to secure UK commercial ports, given reports more recently of individuals with links to the Russian military entering via these routes?
I think it's an entirely reasonable point that the Honourable Lady has made. I think she will understand that I won't want to get too much into the detail of that. We do look at these matters very carefully. We do work across government and with law enforcement and with the intelligence agencies on it. Again, one of the reasons that I now sit across two government departments is to ensure that our response is coordinated as effectively as possible. She's right to raise it. We're doing everything that we possibly can to counter it.
Final question, Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has referred to the threat that Russia poses to UK national security. A former Irish TD, who was also a Deputy Chief of an Irish Army unit, said if you are looking to affect a Western country with extensive assets and poor security culture, then Ireland is ground zero. It's a playground for them, when he was specifically speaking of Russian intelligence. The Minister has rightly referred to working with EU partners, international partners. Can I seek reassurance that he's also working with the Irish Government and Irish security forces to ensure that the Republic of Ireland doesn't become a soft way in to Northern Ireland and indeed the rest of the United Kingdom?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think that is an entirely reasonable challenge, and I can give him the assurances that he seeks.
That is the end of the statement. I'll give the front benches a moment to shuffle over, and we will have the Select Committee statement shortly.